there's two types of mock meats. I've had the Impossible Burger. I've never craved an Impossible Burger. There's so many great burgers you can get out there. Shake Shack, Five Guys, In-N-Out. Why would I go to get this Impossible Burger unless I was doing it like vegan stuff? But then there was also supposed to be 3D printed meats. And this stuff seems to be taking forever. Where is this at? Because there was a story in the Wall Street Journal about how poorly this is apparently going.
So there's 3 categories of these alternative proteins to traditional animal protein. The first is these, call it alternative proteins, where you use things like soy protein or pea protein. Beyond Burger is a good example. They have a pea protein-based burger. And so that category was kind of hot for a minute, where everyone was like, oh, it's an eco-conscious decision. People will make the shift. And, Beyond Meat had this massive IPO and the stock went crazy. And someone said it was the biggest return ever for Kleiner Perkins. But it really was just taking plant protein, processing it, and trying to make it sort of mimic the texture and flavor and taste of animal protein. And it's more expensive. So I've generally been fairly negative on whether that really moves the needle, right? The needle for me is, can you replace animal proteins traditionally and stop using all this land and putting all this carbon into the atmosphere and all this water and all these resources that we use to make all these animal proteins, which I think is both kind of ethically incorrect, but also extraordinarily environmentally. So the more challenging technical solution is the other 2 categories. The second category is, can you synthesize animal proteins using recombinant DNA? So this is where you take the DNA that codes for the protein, whether it's the milk protein or the egg protein or the cheese protein, and you put it in a bacterial cell or a yeast cell that are used to from that we use to make wine, that we use to make beer. And they eat sugar, and then they spit out a product. And in the case of wine and beer, they eat sugar from grapes or from malt or whatever, and they spit out alcohol, ethanol. And Genentech was the first company to really pioneer recombinant DNA at a mass scale. They basically used recombinant DNA to make insulin. So they took the DNA from humans that codes for insulin, the gene for insulin, they put it in E. coli bacteria, and then they put the E. coli bacteria in a big tank, and the E. coli start to duplicate, and they make all this insulin. And that's how we make all the world's insulin today. It's using that biomanufacturing process. And it's how we make all of biologic drugs. All antibody drugs are made this way. It's a $300 billion a year market just in biologic drugs. So when CRISPR kind of came about in 2012, suddenly the toolkit to go in and do a much better job and a much cheaper job of editing the genomes of these little microbes to make them more efficient at making these proteins became standard. And everyone said, let's go use this new category of what's being called synthetic biology or synbio to make all these animal proteins that we use animals to get today. So the key metric in that second category is productivity, grams per liter per day. How well can you get that little microorganism to make that protein? The more protein it makes per day, the cheaper the price per protein. And we're still a far ways off from getting this to be price competitive. So that's a challenged category right now. There's a lot of, I'm invested in a couple of companies in this space where we're trying to make it faster and cheaper to do that strain engineering, to edit the genome up front and make those little cells more productive to bring the price per gram down and hopefully make it compete ultimately with the traditional market for eggs, cheese, milk, et cetera.
But what is the constraint? Is it an energy constraint or is it an actual biological incapability?
No, so the great thing is on a first principles basis, the biophysics indicates that this should make proteins cheaper. And that is good for the planet. It's good for human health. It's good for everything. We should be able to make eggs, cheese, milk, all this stuff exactly the same as what you get from an animal without the animal, because the biophysics of a single cell making it is better than the biophysics of a whole animal. Think about a chicken. It grows feathers, it clucks, it walks around, it has energy, it makes heat. So the chicken as a system is not that energy efficient. But a little cell that just eats sugar and it's programmed to do one thing and one thing only, eat sugar, make protein, eat sugar, make protein, and spit as much of it out, you theoretically can make it way more efficient. Exactly. Now, we're making great progress, but we're not there yet. We're not at commodity price points.
No, why? I'm trying to ask why. Where's the failure point?
There's 2 failure points. Sorry, I should say there's 3. The first is strain engineering, which is you want to shuffle all the other genes in the organism to stop doing things like growing a bigger cell wall or, taking your time to duplicate. You want to change the genome of the cell to get it to do stuff faster. The second stage is process engineering. When you put that cell in a tank, you're changing the sugar, the methanol, the CO2, the oxygen, the pH, everything about that tank and the condition of the tank has to be adjusted. So there's about 60 variables. And those 60 variables all need to be tuned and tweaked before you optimize the performance of production. The third category is the hardest, which is scale manufacturing. There's about 100 million liters of biomanufacturing capacity on Earth today. 95 million liters is owned and operated by companies that use, and when I say biomanufacturing capacity, I'm talking about big stainless steel tanks. You pour water, you pour sugar, you pour your cells in, they make copies and they make your stuff. Of that 100 million liters, 95 million is owned and operated by companies. 5 million is available for rent. Of that 5 million liters, 4 million is rented for its entire lifespan by some company, usually a biologic drug company, because very little of this is being done in food today. So there's only 1 million liters left to rent. And there's 200 synbio startups trying to make animal proteins, and they've all competed for this capacity. So the capacity cost has gone up by about fourfold.
But it sounds like the latter two you can overcome with capital, but the first one is really bounded by science.
It's more engineering because what you track is kind of what's called the titer curve, which is grams per liter. And the more experiments you do, the higher that number goes. And so if you can increase your experimental rate.
And the few grams that it does produce today, when a normal person tastes it, they're like, yep, this tastes the same as a Wagyu ribeye.
No. So remember, I'm talking about proteins right now. I'm not talking about cellular meat. I want to talk about cellular meat last, which is the hardest category, which is what you're talking about. I'm talking about taking that protein and then using it to make a product like a cheese, or using it as an egg replacer, that kind of stuff. It's the same protein as what you would get from eggs or milk or what have you.
This all just sounds so hard.
Well, it's a big problem and it's a lot of money. So
is it a problem?
Eggs alone are $200 billion a year. I mean, the methane released from cows is one of the largest contributors to global warming. It's a real problem.
Also, we're going to need to solve this, Chamath, if we're going to
lot of resource constraints.
If we're going to colonize Uranus, we're going to need to get food there.
I just asked a question, like if you go after the high emission categories first, do you give yourself room to leave these things because you're doing so much already? Just a question.
Animal agriculture emissions are one of the largest and unfortunately one of the biggest drivers, because as people's GDP per capita increments, the first thing they spend money on is protein.
No, I get it. I'm saying something different, which is if we just invented better heat pumps, you'd have industrial heating and cooling, which represents like almost a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. You get that off. And you give yourself a lot of time and space and room, and maybe you let the cows roam and belch and burp because the meat just tastes better and you don't have to spend a bunch of time and effort.
I don't think it's an or. I think it's an and, Chamath. I think we should be doing all these things. And I think that I'm a big believer, as you guys know, in markets. So I'm not a believer in transition for the sake of, carbon saving, because people aren't going to pay a premium, as we've seen with the kind of alternative meat market.
$15
people want cheaper
hamburgers are not
markets
working.
Want cheaper. So if you can make proteins cheaper, it's also a great ROI. You can make money doing this, and the market will buy it because it's cheaper protein.
Sorry,
I just want to hit on this because we keep sidetracking a little bit. The third category is the one that the article was about, which is cellular meat. So cellular meat is where you're trying to make your Wagyu or your shrimp or your fish. You're trying to make cells, not just proteins, but entire cells. And those cells stick together and they look and cook and feel and taste like cellular meat, like muscle, like what you eat when you eat fish or beef or whatever. And the problem there is you're trying to take a cell, and cells normally grow on, bones and on tissue. And so there's scaffolding and all these systems that hold all the cells together. And so to get cells to grow in a tank and stick together and replicate without other cells signaling them turns out to be really expensive. There was an executive at Merck I spoke to a few months ago, and he said, we're going to sell fetal bovine serum, which is basically like this liquid that they get from the fetuses of cows. Oh. And this is how cellular meat started. They took a cell from a cow and they put it in a tank with fetal bovine serum, and the cells started to replicate and duplicate. And then they could take those cells and try and turn them into a beef, into a burger, and sell it or try it. That was the $1 million burger, if you remember that, a couple of years ago. And fetal bovine serum market has gone through the roof because so many companies are trying to make cellular meat. And the Merck exec was like, we're going to sell $1 billion of fetal bovine serum, and then we're going to sell zero because no one's going to be able to make money doing this. It's just impossible. You're not going to sell $500 burgers. So the technical challenge there is you have to edit the cells to get them to duplicate. You have to get them to grow in suspension, meaning in a tank, instead of growing on bones and growing next to each other and scaffolding. And then you have to change the feedstock so that you're creating all these other proteins and signaling factors and hormones that you pour into the tank that trigger those cells to grow. I just want to restate again for the final time, these are identical cells and identical proteins to what you're getting from the animal. So they are not like what we talked about in that first category, where you're trying to get other stuff to sort of taste like meat. You're literally trying to create the meat and create the protein using these systems. So I want to just get back to the unit economics. The cost per kilogram or the cost per gram of the protein, we are still many orders of magnitude away on cellular meat. So the problems you're laying out are really down the road problems of optimization. Right now, we've got more fundamental problems on how do you actually get this stuff to be cost competitive. Now, fortunately, the tools of CRISPR, and since CRISPR-Cas9 came out 10 years ago, there are now hundreds of variants that are open source, IP-free, royalty-free, and used very broadly and generally, and DNA sequencing costs continue to decline. Those are the two basic tools that are being used by biochemists and engineers to do rapid evolutionary iteration needed to produce the recombinant production of proteins, to produce the new cells, to produce the feedstock for those tanks. And there's a cost curve that we're trying to get over. It's not happening overnight. Hundreds of millions of dollars, and in several cases, billions of dollars have gone into these systems. And it's very likely that these companies may need several more years and several billion dollars. We are going to get there. The technology is progressing. The rate of progress is a little slower, and it's a little more challenged, I think, than the first round of investors had hoped. But I do think that scientifically and first principles, it is absolutely feasible. It's a function of engineering our way there to giving Chamath and everyone else that eats burgers and chicken nuggets everything that they want, hopefully at a lower price.
If you put it on the curve of self-driving cars, we have Cruise doing some automated taxis in like a very constrained area in San Francisco, but we don't have it everywhere. Where do you put this on the curve?
It's a great question. So what's happened, by the way, as we've gotten down the cost curve, we are unlocking new markets. So new products are being produced, existing proteins that come from animals. There's a good example, a product called pepsin. It's extracted from pigs today. It's very expensive, similar to how we used to make insulin. And we're replacing the sourcing of that product. We replaced insulin, which we used to get from pig spleens. We now make it recombinantly. We're now replacing pepsin. We're replacing the rennet that's used to make cheese. So as we move down the cost curve, these what are called high value proteins are the first to fall. Those markets collapse because we now make them recombinantly. They collapse in price because they're now cheaper using recombinant systems instead of taking them from animals. And eventually we'll get to that cost curve where they're ubiquitous for all proteins or for all types of cells. In the meantime, there are pretty sizable markets to go after. These are multi-billion-dollar markets that are getting knocked down. We don't talk about it every day. It doesn't show up in the news, but it's really profound and interesting to see that this technology is working. It's overturning multi-billion-dollar markets. It's making progress, and hopefully it'll get to the point that everything from the chicken nugget to the kelp-fed salmon can.
Have you guys tried a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger?
I've had it.
I've tried them a long time ago, but I've not tried them recently.
It's like eating something mushy that's 60% of an average hamburger. It's not worth paying double for, certainly, for somebody who's a hamburger eater.